Hello everyone, we're going to talk about Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is a novel with maybe a claim to being the greatest American novel of the 20th century. So the title of this video is Toni Morrison's Beloved, Haunted by the Ghosts of History. So what I'm really interested in doing in this video is talking about how Toni Morrison uses a ghost story to talk about the traumatic past of slavery, how slavery and the legacy of slavery haunts the present. How do we as individuals, as citizens, as people living within a political community and within a history, how do we live in a world where ghosts are real? So Morrison's Beloved, I think, certainly has a claim to being one of the greatest and most important American novels. And one of the reasons for that is Morrison provides us with a complicated, sensitive, and penetrating analysis of the evils of slavery. So there's a whole host of things we need to talk about in this video. We need to talk about family, we need to talk about history, we need to talk about ghost stories and the Gothic genre. So let's just lay some groundwork and talk about the family tree in this novel. The family is an important image here because one of the things that Morrison wants us to think about, is how trauma can be inherited. How do crimes committed against one generation reverberate and echo across generations so that even descendants suffer for crimes done against ancestors. Okay, so let's just try to get a handle on this family tree. This novel is really centered around this woman, Sethe. Sethe is a woman who liberated herself and her 4 children from slavery. Now, while she was enslaved, she was married to this man named Hallie, but we understand at the beginning of the novel that Hallie is long gone. And we also learn that one of Sethe's children, Beloved, is dead. And in fact, Beloved, who died as a baby, appears to haunt 124. And that causes Sethe's 2 boys, Howard and Bugler, to run away from home. And shortly after that, baby Suggs, Hallie's mother, who lives with Sethe and her children, also dies of old age. For some time then, Sethe lives alone with her only remaining daughter, Denver, until a man named Paul D., who was also enslaved at Sweet Home, arrives and moves in. But then, in a strange and somewhat foreboding turn of events, Paul D's actions seem to bring Beloved back to life. Toni Morrison, like other Black thinkers like Ida B. Wells or Martin Luther King or Frederick Douglass, spells out for us, helps us understand that slavery is America's great crime, its great original sin. And I think this novel helps us to recognize a kind of paradox at the core of American history. In a certain sense, the United States of America represents a radical experiment in political freedom. America has historically been a model of freedom and equality that has inspired democratic movements across the world. It is not wrong or historically inaccurate for us to say that America has provided a blueprint for what might politically be possible. But paradoxically, the same country, the same culture that arguably reinvented democracy for the modern world, also embraced and tolerated brutal abuses of human dignity and freedom. Slavery in the United States has to be understood as a kind of institutionalized evil, and in this bizarre way, it's a crime against the very principles that are at the core of the American experiment. The idea of the United States of America is that all people could be free and live equally under the law. And yet the reality of chattel slavery is that one category of people were tyrannized by another based purely on their race. And so to examine American slavery in the way that Morrison does through Beloved is to delve into this dark paradox in American history. How could a nation so committed to freedom commit such a crime against human freedom? And what Morrison's novel, Beloved, I think helps us understand is that this great crime in early American history still haunts that nation today. Many of the problems and tensions and controversies in American politics today are traceable to the legacy of American chattel slavery. This novel really revolves around 2 interconnected crimes. One is a private, domestic, familial crime, and the other is a historical, political crime. At the center of this novel is Sethe, and the thing she is living with, trying to deal with, is that she has murdered one of her own children. Sethe is a mother who has killed her own child. But this specific personal crime takes place within the context of this much larger political, historical crime, and that's the institutional injustice of slavery. So one of the things we have to work out is, what is the relationship between these two crimes? One thing we ought to recognize is that Setha's crime is a consequence of the much larger political historical crime. It's precisely because of the unjust context in which Setha lives, the past that haunts her. It's the danger that she's in and the violence that she and her family are subjected to that prompts her, motivates her to kill her own child. Now, maybe the biggest question that the novel wants us to consider is how a human being can go on. How can a person like Setha live with what she's done? And by extension, how can a whole country like the United States live with what it's done? And I'm using various terms and words, but I think all of them are open to interrogation, right? Is it right to say we could overcome these injustices? Can we transcend them? Can we move past them? Maybe that's all wrong. Maybe we can never overcome such grave crimes. Can we forgive crimes that seem to be unforgivable?
Now, I want to put some pressure on this "we" here, because I think it's fair to say it's not all inclusive. For example, in situations like this of grave historical injustice, when one group of people, one race, has perpetrated crimes against another, it's not really up to white people to say when it's time to move on, when we ought to forgive. Nevertheless, it would seem as members of a political community, we have to find some way to go on and hopefully to live together and to find some new, more just equilibrium, some reconciliation. How do we do that? One thing we need to recognize is that to overcome injustice, the guilty need to atone. The offending party needs to recognize the harm that they've done. One thing we often hear from people in the modern world, the contemporary world, is people will say, well, I bear no responsibility for this. I did not participate in these unjust systems of the past. But the legacies of these unjust systems persist. And those of us who are white need to recognize that we continue to benefit from the legacies of these unjust systems. So we do need to recognize that. And unless we do that, we will continue to be haunted by our past. On Beloved, Morrison wrote, I decided that the single most uncontroversial thing one can say about the institution of slavery vis-a-vis contemporary time is that it haunts us all. That in so many ways all our lives are entangled with the past, its manipulations, and fearful of its grasp, ignoring or dismissing or distorting it to suit ourselves, but always unable to erase it. And this, I think, is where the ghost becomes such a powerful image for Morrison. This is why Beloved is a ghost story. This is a story about being haunted by the past, about what it means for a person to be haunted by things that they've done, and what it means for a country to be haunted by an unjust history. Morrison's novel is set in the late 19th century, and in literary history, the 19th century is the century of the Gothic horror novel. So let's talk for a second about the Gothic. Gothic literature or Gothic horror is a genre which typically revolves around suspense, mystery, and death. Gothic literature often features supernatural elements, monsters, and the occult. It's likely that you're already familiar with a lot of 19th century Gothic horror novels. Frankenstein, for instance, was written early in that century. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, Dracula, H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man. All of these are Gothic novels. But historically, think about what's going on during the 19th century in the American context. In the middle of this century, we get the American Civil War. In 1865, the 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. But then throughout the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, there's a white supremacist backlash where lynching takes place, all sorts of disenfranchisement and voter suppression legislation to further oppress black people. So Morrison, I would argue, is turning to the Gothic novel in order to find a language, a way to talk about the horrors visited upon black people in 19th century America. And in some ways, Morrison is engaging with the literary genre of the Gothic itself, because as Meisha Wester says, Gothic texts often contain social discourses on racial politics concealed beneath a veil of monstrosity. Gothic texts often use the figure of the monster to talk about foreignness, otherness, and racism. Morrison is using the genre of the horror novel, the monster novel, and Beloved is, as an undead being, this kind of ghost, is a sort of monster. But Morrison is reversing this picture, or maybe holding up a mirror to it. She's showing us that the real monsters, the real thing we ought to fear, is the tyranny of white people, and maybe more generally, the whole history of white supremacy. So once again, thanks everybody. I appreciate it.